hate my model railroad, and it is possibly time, after almost 11 years in construction, to tear it down and start over again. And that's going to be our first order of business here in 2024, and the first episode of Train Orders. Okay, do I actually hate my model railroad? Well, sometimes yes, but in general, no. And am I going to be tearing it down to make way for something new? Not entirely. But there are some issues that are presenting themselves in scenes much like this on the layout. And what got me thinking about this was I was doing all of my preparatory work for the holidays to get trains running. And man, I was having some gremlins show up. And it was a combination of in the rolling stock and in the track work. And I thought, I'm probably not the only person that's gotten to the point where they're like, this sucks, I'm done, and maybe I just need to start over again because this can't be repaired. And so that got me thinking that, well, since I'm probably not the only person that feels this way, is that really the right thing to do? And obviously, my answer is no, that's not the right thing to do. My bigger concern is finding, well, why am I having issues and are they repairable issues? So I decided I'm going to start this new this new episode, I guess, and it's going to be called Train Orders. We're going to do one once a month, and it's going to get into the ugly side of model railroading, and that is, this is not setting up a toy train set under your tree or running a basic loop of track. This is trying to operate a basement size, fully automated sort of model railroad, DCC signals, the whole 9 yards. And so we're working towards that. But when things like this happen, it's sort of a setback. And so what I want to do is talk about things that have popped up on my railroad that I've noticed, you may have noticed, and things that we probably can figure out and we don't have to completely redo our model railroad. And so in this case, today we're going to be talking about track work. Unfortunately, the issue that you're seeing here is not related to track work. So we're not going to talk about it too much because this is 100% a rolling stock issue. I got some bad couplers, got some bad wheel sets, and I've got some cars that are way too light for this railroad. And so that's another issue. That's another topic. We'll talk about that at another time. So what we're going to do is get into the gremlins that may appear in your track work and what you can do to fix those gremlins. Now, when we had the videos towards the end of last year that were kind of like getting started in N scale. Got good reviews, got good comments, got a lot of people interested in some things. So Train Orders is going to be a continuation of that, and we're going to continue to just talk about these little issues that may pop up that are alternatives, let's say, to starting over after 11 years of building a layout. So, all right, let's go ahead and get in, and today's topic, we are talking about track work and what happens when your track work sucks. First step in making sure that your train layout performs correctly is to avoid complicated track geometry. The real railroads do it, and you should too. And the reason that they do that is, well, it's pretty expensive to maintain. So crossovers and switches, turnouts, they all take heavy abuse. And so when you have that sort of condition on your railroad, that is going to be a maintenance nightmare. In model railroading, it's more of a place where you're going to have a derailment. So in the case of small industrial areas or switching layouts, complicated track geometry is basically what you're going for. So if you're trying to avoid it, then are you really getting out of your layout what you want? So if you can't avoid it, and you have to have something complicated, like this section here on my own layout, then you've got to have good track work. And if you don't, it's going to be a constant source of frustration for you because you're going to have turnouts that don't line correctly. You're going to have derailments. You're going to have just a mess. Now, these areas, especially like this area on my layout, is operated at slow speeds. So I get away with a lot more on my switching areas than you would if you were doing something like this crazy on a main line. So I can put relatively tight turns and whatnot because, well, I'm using small wheel-based cars and I'm using small wheel-based locomotives to get in and out of this industry. So the tightness of this radius doesn't really affect it too much. It still looks realistic and I can get into my industry. So make sure your turnouts work correctly. Let's take a look at what a not functioning turnout looks like. Okay, so here is our first example of a turnout that needs some work. So if I open this up, everything looks fine, and I just powered up my Bachmann. So there's that. But when I go to close it, you'll notice that it doesn't quite touch against the stock rail. And that will be a continued source of issues because as I work this back and forth, if I don't get a tight closure against that rail, eventually I'm going to have a car that picks it. And you can see that just by being able to push it over there. So what I want to do is get in here and find out why this isn't properly closing. 9 times out of 10, it is something scenery based here in the turnout. My absolute favorite tool for this kind of repair is a fan brush. And I can get that in here and I can sort of get it underneath the rails. I just saw a little piece of stone go flying out of there, so I think that may have been at least part of our issue. And nope, didn't quite fix it. So I want to get in here and see if I can't find out what is causing our rail to not come all the way over. And so you want to look at the moving parts of your turnout, and that is right here where the rails attach to the adjacent track, and then down here at the point. And anywhere in between there is a great place for loose scenery material to get stuck. And we want to make sure we get that out. Okay, so after a bit of light brushing, we are back up and running, and I'm getting a nice close against the stock rail. So that is exactly what I need. And here we'll take a look. Here's another one. You can see that it's not quite closing all the way. And well, that time it did. So I might have moved out. But obviously, you can see that I've got some loose stone here. So step number 1 is where you've got movement on your railroad. Pay particular attention. And I don't care if you're using the Cato Unitrack. I don't care if you're using, Pico, Atlas. They're all susceptible to obstructions because they move. And, I just watched a video, somebody who's just starting in the hobby, and he was talking about getting ballast stuck in his locomotive gears underneath. And my first thought was, okay, that's a problem because you shouldn't have loose ballast on your layout. But you can see that here even I do. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to take the vacuum and I'm just going to suck up any loose material. And in time, just working around it, sometimes you can knock some of this ballast loose, even if you've got glued down properly. So if you're having derailments, and particularly at a turnout, then this is the place to start. Okay, so this is where you're going to want to start to look, and chances are you've got a wheel that's picking the point there and is going off on its own little mission. If you do not own a standards gauge, then you're going to be at a real disadvantage because this comes in handy so often checking for various clearances on the layout. So get yourself an NMRA gauge that you can use to check your points, to make sure that they're closed correctly, and your flanges to make sure that they're functioning properly. And as you go through here, if you notice any area that's not in gauge, well, guess what? That's where you're going to have your derailment. because you're going to force your rails out of the flangeway and into either the outside or the inside of the rail, depending on which way it's going. So always check your track work. And if you've got a system like the Cato unit track, you're not really going to be as susceptible as you are to something that's not, securely fastened to a pre-molded base. So if you're using Atlas, if you're using the Pico turnouts, definitely check those. If you are building one yourself and you don't have one of these, I'm not sure how you're doing it, keeping everything engaged. But I do know they make certain jigs and whatnot that you can set all the rails in. But this is a good check for you. And even if you are using Unitrack, it is possible to break the little plastic tie pins that hold this all together, and you can get your rail out of gauge. So just check it. If you're getting derailments, that could be an issue. Okay, the very last little bit on turnouts, and I believe this is going to apply to pretty much all manufactured store-bought turnouts in N scale. But if you look right where those little brass tabs are, and that's right here, okay, right where my little pointer's at, those actually move. So they rotate ever so slightly when you align your switch. And I don't know if you're going to be able to actually see them move. Yeah, maybe a little bit there. You can see them move. Well, guess what happens when you get scenery material and or more importantly glue in there? Yeah, they don't move. And that will also cause a misalignment. And you can, with a pair of tweezers, kind of grab those things and break them free if you have to kind of make them spin. You can also, if you're not ballasted all the way in, you can take them apart. This whole assembly will come apart. That is really a drastic step, and I do have a video, I think it's going back at least a year or two, on taking one of these number 4s apart. But it actually was this one. But anyway, so that's the last part on a turnout that you really got to check. And if you're getting a condition where your say your turnout throws electronically aren't working, check to make sure you're getting a full connection, because sometimes you're not getting enough power to the coil. And then also check to make sure that you don't have a physical block on it, because that'll mess you up too. Scenery material is going to be your number one fouler of track. It's gonna happen. And if you're gonna do winter and you don't want it to look like, I didn't want to derail my trains, and you don't put snow between your rails, it's not gonna look right, but it's gonna operate better. So you need to make a decision on whether or not you're going to spend the time to keep your flangeways clean, or whether you're going to just go with, I'm going to go a little less prototypical. So obviously I opted here for the realism over the operation, but I was able to get both. And what I used here, and let me show you the tool. We'll just come around. Bear with me here as I dig in my toolbox of goodies. But these are sculpting tools that are, well, that end not so much, but this end, very useful for keeping material out of flangeways or scraping it back once you get it there. And this one is probably my favorite, because it has this nice little sort of a knife edge here that you can use to scrape it clean. And then on the other side, you've got this nice little point right there that just pulls material away. So those are great. And what you do is you can just sort of take it into the flangeway here and just scrape along the flange and pull that material away from the rail if you're not getting good connectivity, or if your cars are jumping over. You're probably not going to have as much issue on the straight sections as you do on the curves, but in any event, you want to just get in there and pull this stuff away. Once you get it scraped down to the point where it's not impacting your locomotives anymore, then you can, in your rolling stock, then you can just vacuum whatever's out. So I've been working on that, because right around the corner here where the curve is, the new scale trains locomotives did not like that curve, and they were hopping right there. So get yourself a set of tools just like this. You can get them at Michael's or any other craft store. I think the set of like 20 tools was 10 bucks, 15 bucks, something like that. So not a real expensive investment, and it will do wonders in keeping your scenery away from your tracks. Well, not your tracks, but moving parts of your track anyway. And don't limit that just to snow, because not everybody has snow on their layout, obviously. Ballast. Ballast is a number one fouler of track because it gets glued into place, it gets glued, tucked along the rail. So taking care to ballast correctly is big. It should be secured. You shouldn't have loose pieces. You definitely shouldn't have it getting in your locomotive. And then even beyond that, you shouldn't have it touching up against your rails on the inside or on the top, obviously. So if you do that, definitely take a look at what's going on there, because that's probably a scenery no-no. So you're going to have that more on areas like this. So this probably not too terrible because you're down below the flangeways, but if you get one of those, we'll call them the pizza cutter micro trains type deals, you can have an issue. So just knocking that away goes a good way into getting a little better operation. So just keep your ballast away from your rails. Now, if you do have areas where you're doing a grade crossing and you've got to get it up against there, just make sure you keep this area clean. Otherwise, once again, you're just going to pick that. You're gonna ride up over it and it'll pop right off the rails, especially if you're on a curve. Okay, so the next little bit that we're going to take a look at is your joints. And so if you're using Kato Unitrack, Atlas Snaptrack, or Bachmann Easy Track, and you've got them molded on road base, then it's not too difficult to get a good alignment because you've got not only the metal rail joiner, but you also have the plastic clips underneath that sort of hold everything in place. It is possible to get a little bit of a rough joint sometimes, and you just got to make sure that you're aligned properly. And usually you can make that go away by replacing the joiner. But if you are in a little more advanced stage and you've got everything balanced and scenic and you're having derailments at joints, then the easiest way to fix that is, first of all, come over and just rub your finger against it. And if you don't feel any bump, then your joint is probably okay. But if you rub your finger over it and you find a misalignment, and it'll stand out pretty good. You'll feel it, and if you're feeling it in your finger, then your rolling stock is feeling it as well. What you want to get yourself is some needle files, and try not to get the shine on there. But these files are great because what you can do, there's different sizes and shapes and profiles depending on what you're trying to do here. But if you come down onto the joint and you just file it down, you can get it pretty smooth. And let me take you up the layout here and show you. You can see how the tips there have been sanded smooth a little bit so they line up a little bit better. And that is what you're trying to do here. So if you've got a bump in your track, it's going to cause your wheels to hop. And if they hop, then there's a likelihood, especially on curves again, that they're going to derail. So take a look at that and double check to make sure that your joints are nice and smooth. If they're not, then a quick file down should solve the issue. I recommend you do this with the track power off, because if you cross the two rails, you'll obviously short out because these are metal. But if you get in there and just sand it down, preferably after you haven't just used it to file down some hydrocal, then you should be good and ready to go. Keeping your trains running and running smooth on the layout is an important part of the hobby, because if your trains aren't running, eventually you're going to get upset with your railroad and you're going to want to quit. And it's very easy to feel that way, especially when you have spent hours and hours and hours chasing a gremlin that just doesn't seem to always be there. And so you get to a certain point where you need to isolate the problem. And is it a certain car that always derails? A certain locomotive? Is it in a certain location? and if it's not in a certain location or a certain spot, what am I doing when it's happening? And so if you're noticing that a particular car is derailing at a particular spot, and it happens no matter what, or it happens frequently enough that it's a problem, then you need to start looking at not necessarily the track work, but the car or locomotive itself. And that's going to be a topic for another train order, but definitely don't rule out if you've cleaned the flanges and you've swept up all the scenery material and you've checked everything else that it could possibly be, and there's nothing else, then you need to look at the piece of equipment itself, because that's probably where the issue is going to be. Okay, and so the final thought for this episode is on parts like this swing gate that we're sitting on right now. There's no way to avoid a joint, because obviously it needs to open and close, and therefore you're going to have a joint in the tracks. And trying to make that joint as smooth and continuous as possible is necessary for good train operation. Otherwise, you're going to get a derailment every time. And remember, it needs to be able to operate in both directions. So trains need to be able to go both ways over it and not have an issue. Otherwise, you need to look into it. But the other thing that you need to watch is how your track is actually sitting. So if it's not level, and let's say it's tilted just a little bit, or one of the rails sits a little bit higher because you've got it sort of cockeyed on installation, you can get actually too much lean, almost like too much super elevation in your track, and you can cause your train to derail. I was having that issue here on this bridge with these small little hoppers, and then I realized it actually wasn't the track so much as it was the car themselves. Just had too much wiggle on top, and they'd wiggle themselves right over. So just take a look at your cross section and make sure that your track, if it is super elevated, it's at a reasonable super elevation and not, exaggerated, because if it's exaggerated, then your trains are going to lean too far one way or the other and likely lead to derailment. Okay, so hopefully these tips were helpful if you are to the point where you're getting ready to throw your hands up in the air because the trains just aren't running correctly. And if they help you out a little bit, that's great. If there's any other issues that you're having related to your track work that you want to see discussed here, feel free to leave a comment down below, and we'll try to address it. I do try to address all the comments that I get. Some of them, as of late, I'm not real sure what was being asked, but if I don't answer your question, I may have been momentarily confused as to what it was you were trying to accomplish. But in any event, I do try to answer all of the comments as best I can. And if I don't know something or haven't experienced something, I'll just tell you that, because I'm not going to give you advice that, well, I don't know. So if you come up with something, feel free to leave me a comment. I've experienced quite a lot of different things here, so you're not likely to stump me, but it happens every now and then, so I'll apologize in advance. Until then, everybody enjoy your smooth running model railroad.